never thought, actually, that we will talk of geopolitics in such a festival right after the opening speeches. But that means that we live in interesting, may I say, dangerous times, that geopolitics is so important today. And we have an excellent panel today with us to discuss the topic, the geopolitical landscape of the future. So let me introduce the speakers. First of all, Jaime Nogueira Pinto, university professor, political thinker and writer from Portugal. Then Arta Moini, research director at Institute for Peace and Diplomacy from the United States. Then Patrick Deneen, professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, also from the United States. And last but not least, Gad Taub, historian, professor at the Hebrew University from Israel. And I am Attila Demko, head of the Center for Geopolitics at MCC. So my first question would be to all of the panelists, beyond how we got to this situation, to this, let me say, interesting or even more a dangerous situation. What is the landscape now? Where are we now in the middle of 2022? What is your general view? Not your particular local view, but the general view of global affairs today in late July 2022. Maybe, Gadi, let's start with you.
Okay. I think that before we address the particular questions that are now before us, foremost Russia and Ukraine, behind that China and Iran, we need to first think on what is the general framework within which the West seeks to address international problems. About 10, 11 years ago now, John Fonte, published from the Hudson Institute, published a book called Sovereignty or Submission, in which he said that, in his opinion, the struggle in the West throughout the whole of the 21st century would be between the globalist transnationalist camp, who gave us international institutions which allegedly transcend the nation states, and those who support nation states. And we see this rolling. It was actually, people didn't take Trump seriously enough when in the UN he laid the metrics of international politics in this way, a controversy between globalists and nation states. And I think that ironically, the camp of globalists and internationalists has created, outside the democratic mechanism, a powerful instruments which had enabled it to overcome the will of most peoples to hold on to nation states. And that, and if you look at it this way, you see that failure has not deterred them. They have failed they were surprised by Ukraine, because they thought that if you manage to enlarge internationalism far enough, then there would be Kant's perpetual peace. But the attempt to enlarge this international European Union to encompass Ukraine is, according to some commentators, what brought this war, because this is what Putin, who has not yet heard of Kant's vision, or maybe heard of it but hasn't yet transcended nationalism enough to accept it, doesn't want any of this. And so, and this is the first front. And the next front, which is maybe worse, is China, because China, unlike Russia, is going to advance its power through the international institutions, as we had such a vivid example of their ability to use the World Health Organization. So I think that any debate of international crisis in the coming years should first be mindful of what the instruments are for solving international controversies. Are they transnational or are they national? I would stick to the vision that was Woodrow Wilson's, that was Theodor Herzl's, a native of Budapest, who was the visionary of Zionism, who thought of humanity as a family of nations, not as one nation in which there would be no accountability. So let me just end by one sentence to say that all the internationalists always have forums that call themselves democratic this, democratic that, but they never give an account of how governments would be accountable to citizens. And in all their global village vision, there is one thing missing: citizenship.
Patrick.
So first, let me thank MCC and this festival and the organizers for the invitation to return to Hungary, which feels more and more like a second home to me. It's wonderful to be back here. I guess I would speak about the situation in the current West by returning us to a discussion that the West was having a little over 30 years ago. In the year 1989, the intellectual political philosopher Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous essay called The End of History. He regarded the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, and the crumbling of the Soviet Union as signaling the end of history in a very particular sense. That the end of history marked the conclusion of what had been a debate, not just in the West, over the entire world, of what was the appropriate or best form of government and social and economic arrangements that in which human beings should live. In 1989, it was argued, proved decisively that liberal democracy was the only and best form of rule that accorded with human nature. It was what was natural for human beings. It was in our nature. It took us many thousands of years to discover this, but we had decisively found that no other form of government was appropriate to human beings. And I would say that in many ways, the lessons of the last few years, with Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump, with the rise of a kind of populism, a rejection by citizens of their leaders, reflects that this idea that history has ended was in fact premature. It seems to me that one of the things we're seeing is the restarting of history, and what's happening in Ukraine is certainly one sad example of this, but nevertheless that it reflects that there is still debate over what is the best and appropriate form for human beings to live in. The claim that liberal democracy was the best form and only form of political organization was based on a few underlying premises and assumptions. The first of this was that human beings could be thought of as having, in some senses, no place and no tradition and no particularity that defined who they were. That human beings should be understood as without history, without place, without a past, and that the social and political organization should reflect that. It should reflect it in our education, it should reflect it in our economic organization, it should reflect it in popular culture. And I think one of the ways in which history has restarted is that ordinary people are rejecting this view. They're rejecting the view that we should embrace the idea of a contextless, a historyless human beings. I think there's no other explanation for why liberal democracies around the world are so critical, for example, of Hungary, which insists on its distinctiveness, of its particularity, of its history and its traditions, in the face of a set of claims that these are no longer to be relevant. So I think the issues that are roiling the Western world, certainly my country, the United States, as well as Europe, issues like immigration, whether or not there need to be boundaries that distinguish a people from another people, issues, as was just mentioned, like the global marketplace and whether or not globalization is appropriate for human beings, and very fundamental issues like the place of the family and the need for a political order to support the family and to support the traditions, including religious traditions, that define a people. I think these are signs that history has begun again, and it is not likely that we are going to see its end anytime in our lifetime.
Patrick, it's just worth mentioning that Fukuyama himself said that no one before him made such a career on a mistake.
Arta, please.
Thank you, and I also want to thank MCC and the organizers for the event and for inviting me to be here. I think we need to think about, when we want to think about the geopolitical landscape moving forward, we also need to go back to the post-war order. The post-war order after 1945, after defeat of Nazi Germany, sort of congregated around a new threat of communism, of Leninist communism in the Soviet Union. Obviously, communism was an ideology, and there was something noble. The title of this panel has global but noble. There was something noble about resisting the communist sort of overreach and expansion. And this was done very pragmatically. It was very realist-based. A lot of the original founders and thinkers of, applicants of realism in U.S. foreign policy, for example, like George Kennan, understood that there was something offensive about the Soviet Union because it was ideological, because it wanted to expand, because it didn't respect the limits of other ways of life, worldviews, and beings in the world, to use a more Heideggerian phrase. So that quest, that noble quest, by the end of 70s and 80s, had already transformed. It had created a different kind of mindset. We were defending for so long that we became basically what George Kennan was warning us that we should not become. We became a mirror image of our enemy. What does that mean? It means that the West started using liberalism, which was the foundations of modern Western culture as well, as an ideological product, and really believing itself, seeing itself within the paradigms of that ideology. The result of that was that after the Soviet Union disappeared and collapsed in '89, there was then a view that just as the Soviet Union believed that there was going to be an international, there was going to be, everybody's going to converge to the end of history in the socialist framework, that now we as the Westerners are going to herald and shepherd the rest of the world into this mentality, into this lifestyle, into this worldview of liberalism. That had some justification in the sense that there was a euphoric moment in early 90s about how we were going to make this happen, and this is what we call the era of unipolarity. There was only one pole left, there was bipolarity, and now we had, from the two poles, only one standing. That unipolarity created this sort of sense of American triumph. This is our moment. Now there's nothing that's going to stay. And ideology was necessary because all the unity that had been aggregated during the 50 years prior now had to be rejustified and recalibrated, and liberalism provided that context. Fukuyama provided that justification, that context. But what actually ended up happening was that with the Soviet threat gone, with the actual ideology gone, people actually are starting to realize over the past 30 years that they are living in another kind of ideology, the ideological framing of liberalism, that we live in a sort of a mirror image, the nemetical image of the sort of Soviet structure in a very different way. We think that we are free, we think that we are great, we think that we are bringing peace and prosperity to the rest of the world, but so did the Soviets. And we should not forget how much that trapping is important today. Now, after 30 years, with this fog of ideology kind of lifting, the rest of the world, the civilizational centers, the regions of the world are coming back. History has returned. They have had chance to recover. And with that, I think we are seeing a recovery of multiplicity, of genuine difference and distinctiveness and distinction, of difference in a objective sense, not in a subjective identity sense, but in a way that we live in different ways of life and different worldviews. If you are living in China, if you're living in Russia, if you're living in Iran, if you're living in India, these are different civilizational spheres, and there are civilizational states that are increasingly representing that way of life. Now, they don't share much other than a general antipathy towards the offensive nature of liberalism today. And this sort of brings us to the precipice of the Ukraine crisis. And I think I will stop there because we can talk more about that. But I think the general worldview that I want to sort of advance here is that we have not only the return of history, we have the return of concreteness, we have the return of reality as opposed to ideology. And ideology and decline of ideology and civilization is something that will increasingly define us moving forward. And we have to think about then what the establishment, the professional managerial class of the West in Brussels, in London, in Washington, D.C.'s response to these sort of tectonic shifts are going to be. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you to MCC for inviting me for this geopolitical discussion. I think, first of all, that all new orders were resulted from general conflicts. We had the order of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War. We had the national and liberal order of the 19th century in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, after the Great War and the First World War and Second World War were a kind of connection. And we have the bipolar order after the Cold War, after the Second World War. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have this, I think we call it the international liberal war. I think it's going out now. This international liberal war has been put at stake by this new conflict in Ukraine. And as I think prior of some of the prior speakers referred, I think we have an illusion, and making the parallel with the Soviet Union, this very optimistic approach of the Fukuyama was, in some sense, the paradigm of this optimistic approach. Now there's nothing more, like Hegel said at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Now we are going, all of us, to be capitalist, democrat, free market, everything. And in some sense, we forgot several things. One of the interesting things is that the Cold War was won by the United States and by the West because they ally with non-liberal powers, like Saudi Arabia and like China. It was decisive. The alliance with Saudi Arabia was decisive for ruining the Soviet Union in terms of the value of their oil exports. And it was a strategy, I think, fought by Bill Casey and other people, but it worked a lot. Second, alliance with China and putting the national competition between China and Soviet Union, that was in some sense the work of President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger, was extremely important also for defeat of the Soviet Union. So there was and it's one point I think at this moment is worrying us, is that the idea of making the conflict now as a crusade of democracies against autocracies is very dangerous and is failing, because you saw, and I think is the important point to read it, is the vote in the United Nations, the list of the people who abstain. And you have together India and China that are, well, terrible enemies, and they align in some sense, and we are staying reduced to the West against the rest, and the West with some limitations, because what I see happening in Europe now is people are starting being critical about saying what I'm going to pay more for my energy or for my food. Okay, very nice, I respect, of course, there's a moral thing. Of course, I think the Russians were obsessed with their security, but in some sense we have to, even if the Russians invaded more people than they had been invaded, but each time they were invaded, they were very bad treated by a lot of people, by the Mughals, by the Polish, by the Swedish, by the French, by the Germans. So they have, it's an obsession, but you have to respect. If they have a beer in your quarters, you have to respect him and be careful. And George Kennan, exactly, in '98, George Kennan, in an interview in New York Times to Friedman, he was very alarmed with this idea of moving east NATO. Henry Kissinger, same. So I think we have to combine ideology and realpolitik. Otherwise, it will be the crisis, and it's going to, because just to finish, looking at what is happening now in the war in Ukraine, what remembers me is the Great War. There's no trenches, but the Great War, people died during 4 years. Millions of people die in these battles, and the front only moved 80 kilometers. And now looking at the maps is what we say, it's not trenches, but we say the tanks go to villages, they take villages, they retake villages, but practically it's the same thing, lots of people are dying. And we see, above all, and I think this is the danger, we see a Manichaean approach of goods and bads, bad guys, good guys, and nothing of a common place where we can find some kind of peace. So it's worrying. Thank you.
Thank you. I think all of you had the idea that history has returned. So actually we saw the end of history in the last few years, not only because of the war in Ukraine, but also before we had seen the rise of ISIL, we had seen the lost wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the failure of, let's say, Western ideological approach in these countries, with bringing democracy to places where democracy was something extremely new and not, in a way, not welcomed. So my question or my idea would be just to be going country by country, how the current war in Ukraine is seen in that country. What are the currents? Because, you know, from Hungary, the United States, Israel, or Portugal seems like a monolith. But of course, there are many opinions in all of these countries. So maybe we could start, Patrick, with how the American, especially how the Republicans see it. What are the currents? Because even the Republicans, they are not united. There are, more the establishment Republicans, and there are others. So maybe a few thoughts on that.
Yes, if those of you who pay attention to American politics through the media, if you've been paying attention to the television programs, CNN, the various commentators, the New York Times, which is a left journal, a left publication, the Wall Street Journal, which is a right publication, CNN, which trends left, Fox News, which trends right, you will discover that there is a unified opinion in the United States on the question of Ukraine, which is that the United States should do everything possible, of course, providing arms, money, expertise, intelligence, data, moral encouragement, strong support, corralling support by allies. You will encounter some voices in those media outlets that argue for the need for direct military engagement, perhaps enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine or parts of Ukraine. So that it would mean direct military engagement between the United States or NATO representatives and Russia. If you get your information and your news from these outlets, you have a very incorrect and inaccurate view of where, broadly speaking, the American public, and more narrowly speaking, where the conservative or Republican public is on the question of Ukraine. There is, as in many cases in the Western world today, there is a deep divide between what we could call elite opinion, those who make elite opinion in places like Washington, D.C., and the views of those who don't get representation in these media outlets. The view of most, I would say, ordinary, regular American people is they do not want to have any direct military conflict with the Soviet Union, and they are skeptical about high amounts of expenditures, high degrees of expenditures to continue to support Ukraine. And you begin to see a bit of this in some of the political figures. One of the senators, Rand Paul, was very critical of the last round of expenditures for weaponry in Ukraine. So that there's a very significant divide. And again, for those of you who pay attention to this question in the United States, this divide will play out in the upcoming, both the elections in the fall, where we will be voting for a new Congress, a new House of Representatives, and a number of new senators. And the question will be sort of what is the message that is being sent by the American public in that election? There are a number of candidates who are running who are very skeptical toward the current U.S. policy in the Ukraine. And if they are elected, that will be a sign or a signal to the current sort of leadership and elites in the United States. But then the real question, of course, will be in another 2 years when there's a presidential election and who eventually receives the nomination on the Republican side, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's someone like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. There will be a strong push by the kind of leadership and elites of the Republican Party to continue to push for what's just been described as a kind of Manichaean good versus evil view of the world. That there's evil powers out there in the form of Russia and China, and that the United States is the force for good in the world. I think there is another element of the Republican Party which is very skeptical of this Manichaean view, that wants not to withdraw from the world, but to embrace a more realist view of America's role in the world, which includes the extent and expansion of our military presence in the world. So I think this is, for those of you who pay attention to American politics, as I know you probably have to, because it is the behemoth in the Western world, I think you need to see perhaps what's not most clearly visible, which is there is a kind of very interesting division that is going to play a significant role in upcoming electoral politics and will have an impact one way or another on the ongoing policies of the United States on this matter as well as other international matters.
Thank you, Patrick. Arta, what is your take, especially on the administration's policy, on how President Biden handled this extreme crisis, in your view?
I'm going to first say something about, sort of continue with my remarks to say, from the sort of first round, to say that the changes and shifts that were coming, and it was mentioned, was in the past decade now, it was sort of like Brexit, it was rise of populism, it was rise of Trump. That created a sense that for the elites, that while we're about to lose it, we're about to lose power, we're about to lose Western unity to these forces of national populism, if we can call it that, who obviously the elites don't respect or care for. So the question became, what can be the threat? Because obviously the endless wars did not work. War on terror was too abstract. Iran was too minor. It had to be a sort of bigger fish. Now, we hear a lot about sort of polarization and polarity. I actually venture to you that when it comes to the ruling class, the establishment, there's not much polarity on the most fundamental issues. If you look at the votes on the most fundamental issues that the system, the Leviathan, is sort of agrees on, there's almost always 89 to 90 votes for and only less than 10 against. So politically, it's actually very, very consolidated, the opinion. What ended up happening from 2016 over to the Democratic Party was to say that let's turn Russia into that sort of evil and enemy, to bolster the Manichaean framing, to give a justification for U.S. power. U.S. power is going to be to counter disinformation, to counter to bolster cybersecurity, and the personification of that is the evil Vladimir Putin. All right. Now, on the other side, and I don't want to, I want to say that this is, again, when it comes to the establishment, this is a very routinized and rudimentary sort of posture. There are many in the Republican side that see China as that sort of threat and evil and a good justifier for a Manichaean framework. Both of them, I think, the pretext might be different, but the actual result is the same. It's going to be bolstering the national security state, the martial regime, and more sort of total control over an expansion of sort of U.S. military footprint. And this is not something that the broader U.S. population wants. Now, in terms of the Ukraine crisis and the war in Ukraine, Biden came to power by saying that Trump had broken all the old promises and all the old compacts of the rules-based international order. And we are going to now refasten the sort of the broken promises. We're going to focus on our allies and alliances. Biden, to his credit, was very good on the issue of Afghanistan. He knew that because he had experience in it, he knew that Afghanistan was not a war that could go on for much longer. But the second crisis of his foreign policy was obviously Russia and Ukraine. And that created the opportunity for the very sort of liberal internationalist voices to then reestablish control and try to say that this is an opportunity, this is a way where we can refasten and reconfigure and actually make the alliance more or make the alliance stronger. Western unity, the free world, autocracy versus democracy, and as such. And this is actually driven by some elements in the Biden administration who are more hawkish than Biden himself. Biden says a lot of the symbolic sort of gestures of autocracy, democracy, all of that. But there are elements like Victoria Nuland, like Antony Blinken. They are much more hardline when it comes to sort of Russia, when it comes to that sort of U.S. expansion and defense of U.S. primacy, as we can call it. So I think what we're likely to see, to project sort of a few years further, is more and more the Democrat Party is going to become the party that will be associated with the elites and with the liberal internationalists, with the ruling class, with the establishment. And that's going to have consequences because more and more it's going to force the other party, at least the base of the other party, to reject those premises. And maybe there is a chance to have a more realistic foreign policy from the right, but we don't know because there are many people on the right that still they want the same U.S. globalist posture, and I think, and it's under different pretexts than the Democrats. And so I think there is an opportunity for change in the U.S. in the near future because the people, and also generationally there is a division, where people who came of age when the U.S. had invaded Iraq and they saw the endless wars are completely against that sort of global U.S. footprint compared to the older generations, the boomer generations, the Fukuyama sort of embodied generation that believes that, no, this is our right, as our God-given right to go to different places and have that kind of democracy promotion and others. So whether it's in the name of rights, whether it's in the name of human rights, whether it's in the name of social justice, whether it's in the name of sovereignty, all these are effectively pretext for an activist foreign policy for a ruling class that's empowered by it. Thank you.
Thank you. If there is a country in the European Union which is far from the current war in Ukraine. We are now only 350 kilometers from the town which was attacked in Ukraine, the closest town. The farthest country is definitely Portugal, with Ireland maybe. And of course you are looking to the south or to Africa and to the Atlantic Ocean more than to the east. So what is the Portuguese view on the war?
Well, let me first of all say that I consider Portugal today the country more on the left in Europe. It's not an aggressive left, it's not violent, it's not, but is practically, after 40 years of authoritarian regime on the right, and without any kind of, I'd say, and without any kind of ideas or references, I think there was a Gramscian normal movement that the left took over, and they only survived, with small exceptions, the only surviving right was the right of the left, the only admitted. So this is a point. On the other side, of course, looking at all these conflicts, our main preoccupation, I think, the average people, is not going to have a third world war with this. So people look nicely to Ukraine. Of course, people are aware that, for example, the causes of war that are invoked by both sides invoke nice ideological causes. Mr. Putin had the idea of going to annihilate the last Nazis in Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky is fighting for democracy. At the end of the day, they both are fighting for the same thing, for nation and for security of the nation. Mr. Putin thought that Russia was in danger, and I think, and excuse me, the moment President Biden said, we never will go in war with Russia, I think Putin interpreted it, okay, please, do it. Because an autocrat always interprets things in the best way, and normally their entourage do not dare to contradict him. So he thought, I can go. Because it was, I think with President Trump, will never happen that. Because he will not say nothing, and they will be afraid that he'll overreact. Not react, overreact. So that will be a dissuasion. But after that, I think that, of course, we see nationalism, nation, patient, nation, all that sort of things. But the most preoccupation of people now is this going to escalate? Is this going to get out of the road, escalate in a kind of, because that, if you ask, do you want to have a nuclear war to defend Ukraine? Nobody will answer yes. Nobody. I think maybe Ukrainians, of course, maybe, or Mr. Zelensky, but people outside, I don't believe that there will be a lot to risk it. So, looking at the rest of the world, what we see is, for example, Central and South America is going to the left, even to the radical left. I was not so surprised by the Colombian election, but it was one of the last. And I think Brazil maybe will be Lula gaining the election in Brazil. So that will be Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile. And those people will not align more with the West on this conflict. Africa, as you see also, the positions were extremely ambiguous and practically rejecting and even Asia is relatively, of course they have the preoccupation, and I think it's a serious preoccupation that China could have looked at it as a window of opportunity with Taiwan, now that people are worried with Ukraine, that the United States, well, is very divided. I never saw the United States so radically divided politically and ideologically. And I must say that as being, of course, more on the side of the United States than on the side of China or Russia, I'm sad when saying that one of the things that the United States exports is the rainbow flag in the embassies. Now we are doing the same there. But some cities in the country oppose that and saying that they reject that. So that's what I would like to say about that.
And there is Israel in a very, very interesting situation, since you have a very large Russian-speaking population. Also, Russia is next door with bases in Syria, and also Iran is playing a part in this conflict. So may I ask you, what is the Israeli view on the war in Ukraine, and are you, afraid that in a way Iran will get strengthened by this war, or in an alliance between Russia and Iran, and maybe China is going to be the end result of this war? How do you see that, Gadi?
Well, I think there are two views in Israel, and I think these two views are prevalent elsewhere in the West, certainly in America. One view is a view of politics as a moral play, where what you should do and the stance you should take is what is morally and aesthetically pleasing, while the other is the realistic school, probably best represented by Henry Kissinger, which views politics in terms of the interests of states. Now, the return of history is the return of nation states and their interests. And what we have now is most clearly a prime minister who chose to see the war in moral terms and is trying to take the politically correct stance, and his predecessor Netanyahu, who is a strict realist. Now, when this war started, our current prime minister, who is, by the way, a journalist, a TV journalist, who didn't finish 12 years of school, and is extremely sensitive and responsive to fashionable, elite, progressive opinions. So the minute this war broke out, he made thundering speeches in favor of Ukraine. While he could have, may I remind you that there is an option to just be quiet. You don't have to jump at to the head of the queue and shout. And what this did is that once he got to power, which was very recently, he's about a month, Putin said that this is a very serious problem, that he is our prime minister. I don't remember Putin ever remarking on who he wants elected in Israel, but clearly he was taken aback. He moved to close the offices of the Jewish agency, something we haven't seen, I don't know, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and is now making noises that he is not pleased with Israeli air operation over Syria, which are never publicly admitted, but everyone, we say in Israel, according to the foreign press, these flights are conducted. And so if now Russia blocks our ability to operate in Syria, it means, what do we do in Syria if it is indeed us? We prevent the Iranians from getting closer to our border and establishing a bridgehead near the Golan Heights. May I remind you that Israel is very, very tiny. You can't drive more than 4 hours in any one direction. So this is a critical thing for us. And seeing politics in terms of this moral drama has seriously curtailed our ability to defend ourselves. Now, Netanyahu immediately responded, a short speech on Facebook, uncharacteristically not directed at the coming elections. And he said, "Why do you talk so much? Why not take your head down? Why do you need to intervene in everything and to make grand declarations?" And looking back at what Netanyahu did, first of all, he was quiet. There are many things on which he could take the stand and make passionate speeches, but he didn't, because what was the game he was playing that is now being trashed? He managed to keep relations with Putin good enough so that Putin's other side, his alliance with Iran and with China, would not completely trump his, if I can use that word, his relations with Israel. And Putin is playing a double game like many places, like he does in Armenia and Azerbaijan, he does in Syria. While he's generally in favor of Iran, he also lets Israel attack them. And now if he won't, it will be terrible. But you look back, Netanyahu, without the moral drama, has managed to preserve very good relations with Putin, extract the most that we can in Syria, while not jeopardizing his relations with the West anywhere. So a small country like Israel, has to calculate its realistic interests and calibrate them very, very gently. If we maneuver smartly, we can pass between the iceberg. But if we make too much noise, the icebergs are bound to be in our way in one form or another.
Well, I think we all agree that the world is not in a very good shape. We discussed it before the panel. What is the best case scenario in your views of this war in Ukraine and actually the new Cold War between China and the US? Is there any way out, at least in our lifetimes, out of this new and very tense global geopolitical situation? Arta, maybe let's start with you.
So the most, I don't know about the best, but the most prudent course when it comes to Ukraine is for moralistic ideological thinking to be sort of pushed aside, and pragmatic statecraft to be prioritized and privileged, which means accepting limits, understanding what's the reality on the ground, understanding that there is no reality in which Ukraine plus the West or the free world can reclaim the lands that Russia has already claimed in the East, to understand sort of the long history and origins of the conflict, and to understand that a negotiated settlement is the only path forward to a more stable, at least in the short-term future, which means less energy crisis, perhaps less inflation, and food crisis. These are fundamental issues, and a lot of people, including Ukrainians themselves, are perishing at the altar of this sort of Manichaean thinking and idealism and utopianism about the ends of the war. There is no future, in my opinion, where Russia could be pushed out of. And, I mean, if you listen to some of the discussions surrounding sort of the need for negotiations, there was a huge backlash by some people in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, or the blob, as some people call it, against sort of negotiating with, as if this was an original sin, to just talk about diplomacy with Russia, which is what you do. You have diplomacy with your adversaries and enemies, and you try to figure a solution. That's reality. That's realism. That's pragmatism. That used to be part of the American discourse, and it's been sort of pushed completely aside for this fictional universe in which the free world is going to triumph over the autocrats and the illiberal forces that darken our universe. It's very Star Wars kind of framing. It's very simple, and it doesn't work. So that's the worst. That's the best scenario that I see to bring this war to an end and stop the suffering of many Ukrainians who are fighting on the promise that the U.S. is going to bankroll their war. This war is continuing because we're allowing it to continue. And this is, I think, even on I'm a realist, I'm a radical realist. I don't believe values have any role in foreign policy. But I do think that actually on normative grounds, on values grounds, this is actually undefensible as well. So that's one way. The other way to think about it, and I don't want to talk very much, the worst case scenario, I mean, I think the worst is already starting to happen, which is the U.S. is losing its influence in the name of defending the free world. The Western unity that we are seeing, that we saw at the beginning of the invasion, I think that is going to be short-lived. I think there's going to be a lot of fissures between Western Europe, France, and even Germany, and Eastern Europe and Central Europe, Poland and V4. I think this is not going to be, and there's also the sort of the Anglosphere, if you will, the UK and the US, who push for different things. And I think the closer, I mean, you basically end up trying to do policy based on your interests. And I don't think, I think Western Europe, specifically France, Germany, Italy, they understand that Putin is not going to invade Western Europe or even Eastern Europe. They are confident in that. And I think that's going to, the more this sort of crisis goes on in terms of energy and gas and food crisis and the rest, the less willingness there will be to prolong this. And I think actually the fissures in the Western alliance might be a result of that. And I don't even think that the liberal internationalists who push for this understand that. Thank you.
Professor.
I practically have the same idea about that, not an ideal world, but what will be good in some sense was to introduce some sense and some real politics to that, and finish with this Manichaean approach to things, to this, what I'd say, Ukrainian, Zelenskyan correctness to look at this, because practically at this moment it's forbidden to say, even if you say, well, first of all, the way news were in the beginning presented to us, I was surprised that Zelensky was not in Moscow now, because the way things were presented in the beginning, with the Ukrainians gaining in so this is, I think this ideological approach, this propaganda approach, that in some sense was to intimidate people that, of course, morally, we can't accept, because we are moral beings, so we can't accept and say, no, there's no problem, Putin was right. No, of course, we can't do that, because there are millions of people suffering, there are thousands of people dying, and it is an imbalancement, and this is all the risks, and so Putin, of course, has to be, in some sense, morally condemned. That is one thing. But we want not to, that is up to God. No, it's not up to us. Secondly, if we want to solve the problem, we have to see why has he done this? Because I don't believe, and I fully agree with you, that Putin wanted to restore the Soviet Empire or something like that. Even in a czarist view, because a long time ago, a friend of mine visited Putin 20 years ago. He said, yes, the painting of Nicholas I, that was not a very good friend of Hungary, I guess. But anyway, was the Tsar reactionary, was not. But Putin, I think, wants to keep Russia as a power in Eurasia. But finish that. And I think after the end of the Cold War, Ukraine must have happened to Ukraine the same thing that happened to Finland during the Cold War. Neutralized. And if they have been neutralized, that will have been better for everybody, starting by the Ukrainians. Because it was this kind of countries that are, and Finland was in the north, and the Ukraine is. So that was a realistic approach to that. I think maybe it's one of the few places where I can say that. If I said that in my country, I'd say killed, but I will be. No, it's terrible, because we practically cannot discuss these things, but in 2 or 3 months, I think reality will come. And I made a distinction between the countries in the West, like Italy, France, even Germany, where the attitude towards Russia is more, I'd say, is not so. People who are close to Russia, of course, has a different approach to Russia than the ones who are like us are far away. And also we have not this dependence on the gas, because our gas comes from Algeria, from north of Africa, so we have not this problem. But the question, I think, is that the public opinion in Europe could change and could force the governments, and that could lead to a split in the European Union, to a serious split in the European Union. Because I see the European Union so engaged in ideological causes. I saw the other day this vote of the this resolution of the European Parliament condemning the Royce West Wade as the United States was still a colony of Europe. It's nuts. People are acting in a mad way and trying to prove that they are correct, politically correct. It's obsession. And that is very dangerous because we don't know what could be an escalation. Thank you.
Patrick, how you see the best case scenario for this conflict?
So, I think the best case scenario is an end to this war. I think it's highly implausible that the end of the war will be won on the battlefield. The end of the war will be through negotiation. And so the sooner that this occurs, the fewer people will die. I'm afraid right now the stance of many leaders in the United States is they are willing to fight this war until the last Ukrainian, which is an immoral position for our leaders to hold. Beyond that, the best case scenario, in my view, would be the end of ideology in our world politics. If we think about the 20th century now into the 21st century, we experienced a kind of century of ideologies governing our politics. First fascism, and then communism, and now liberalism. Each of them had a view of reality into which human beings, human society, and every aspect of the political and social order must be fit, regardless of how many people are damaged or killed in that process. And as we now can see, it seems to me clearly, liberalism is just as clearly an ideology as were the other ideologies. It's a politics based on a certain preconception of how society should be ordered that ignores the complexity of our reality. So the best case scenario to me would be, in some senses, the final overturning of the last ideology of the 20th century, and a replacement of the current ruling class across the West with a ruling class that is defined by a certain kind of humility and an awareness of human limits. A humility that's born of a deep learning and understanding of history, of culture, of language, things that used to be prized among the educated class that people no longer learn in the schools I've taught, including Georgetown. A deep education in the reality of the world that will inform the decisions of the people who hold in their hands whether or not many of us and our children will live or die. Because the worst case scenario is in the form of a nuclear bomb, which will be launched either in a direct war between the United States and Russia or in a direct war between the United States and China. And that's what I fear is likely in our future if the current ruling class continues in its path.
So, from Israel.
I could say one sentence about that. First of all, I hope that Zelensky's bravado will end before Ukraine does. And secondly, I hope that one consequence would be that European nations arm themselves again. Europe has been conducting politics without consequences for too long. It has relied on the power of others, and the other camps are armed. So I think it's a good sign that Germany doubled its security budget, which is still tiny, but it's a good sign.
So just to summarize, I think we all agreed in this panel that we need much more realism in the West for the sake of the good of Ukraine, for the sake of the good of the global community, because ideology is the way right now, I think, to a very, very dire conflict. And I think I am hopeful that in DC, in other capitals, realism will take over ideology in the next few years. So with that, I close the panel. Please join me in thanking the panelists